All right. Well, my name is Doug Dean, and I'm a postdoc research fellow here at the Waisman Center. And I'm really excited and it's a real great privilege to be here and be able to share some of the research that I'm conducting with here at the Waisman Center, looking at quantitative magnetic resonance imaging in brain microstructure within individuals with autism spectrum disorders. And before I actually get started with describing to you what we actually do, I want to first acknowledge what a great team of researchers and collaborators and colleagues that I get to work with every day, not only being able to come here at the Waisman Center, which is an amazing place, as you just heard from Chung, but also working with such a great, wonderful group of people, really spearheaded by Drs. Andy Alexander, Janet Lanehart, who some of you might have seen passing through, participating in research here. Really, it's a wonderful group, and I can't really acknowledge or be thankful so much. And really, our research program for our lab is really to develop and apply advanced brain imaging techniques to, one, determine changes in the brain specific to autism and that might be linked to specific symptoms or outcomes that we see in individuals with ASD, but also to use this type of research to identify brain-based biomarkers that may inform on different causes of autism, different neural mechanisms that might be involved within the symptoms that we see, aid in early diagnosis, and also try to develop preventative interventions and or treatments for ASD. So we use a lot of different techniques to study the research participants that come in through the lab, but I'm really going to highlight some of the methods in that we use for brain imaging. And so to give you just a quick analogy for those who might not be as familiar with magnetic resonance imaging or brain imaging in general, so you might be more familiar with the idea of taking a picture with a camera. So we have a picture with a camera, or you can take a picture with a camera, and you get this really nice photograph of, for instance, my twins back at home. And so in brain imaging, our camera is actually this big magnet. So you lay down in here, and it takes a little bit longer than taking a photo with your camera, but after about 10 minutes or so, we can get these really nice, clear, detailed pictures of the brain. And what's really interesting about MRI is that we can use different types of cameras to get different views of the brain, but also we get this 3D information. It's not just that we get this single picture of the brain. We can look at the brain in all different kind of views and aspects. And that's really exciting because we can use that to look at different parts of the brain, but also ask questions just about the whole brain itself. And one of the reasons why magnetic resonance imaging is so popular in medicine specifically is that it gives us these really detailed, clear pictures of the underlying brain tissue. And in different clinical pathologies, say for like MS or traumatic brain injury, it's really clear to see where something might be wrong in the brain. So in this particular case, you can clearly denote this lesion that exists, and for a doctor that's very informative. But if we were to look at two participants, one that has autism and one who may be typically developing control, those differences are are much more subtle, or at least not visible with some of these traditional imaging methods. And if I were to ask a clinic or a doctor who's really trained at looking at these images, which one of these participants has autism, they would not be able to guess correctly, or maybe guess by chance 50% of the time. And indeed, based on the diagnosis through different behavioral diagnoses, and this one on your left is one that we see with autism. But again, there's no clear, visible demarcation in the brain that tells us that this is the case. Well, I'm going to go back and refer back to this idea of taking a picture now. And just like you can do on your phone, for instance, or we can apply different lenses to a camera to get these different pictures, we can do the same thing with MRI. So we can, what we call, instead of a lens, we call a sequence. So we can apply different sequences or use different sequences from the MRI scanner to get different types of information from the brain. So for instance, we can get images that relate to brain structure or anatomy. We can also look at play different sequences that give us information about brain function, and also different more advanced sequences that give us information about brain microstructure. And that's going to be what I'm going to really focus on today during the rest of this talk, and describe how we're using advanced techniques to really look at the underlying microstructure in the brain. And one such technique is, you might, those who are familiar with imaging might have heard, is called diffusion tensor imaging. And really this technique probes the tissue microstructure by investigating how water diffuses throughout the brain. And the nice thing about DTI, or diffusion tensor imaging, it provides these quantitative imaging measures that reflect the underlying microstructure. In particular, this fractional anisotropy, or FA, is kind of a ubiquitous measure that is used in many different studies, not just in autism, but a whole host of different pathologies in that. That gives us really clear information about the underlying white matter microstructure. And when I talk about white matter, what I'm really referring to is, if we think of our brain as a computer, we have basically two different types of tissue. One is the gray matter that looks kind of gray here in these pictures, and you can think of those parts of the brain really reflecting the processors of the computer. They're the ones that do all the thinking. Whereas the white matter that's shown here in white is actually all the different wires that connect those processors together. And those wires, without those wires, it'd be really difficult for these processors to communicate and also do what they need to do. And the same thing holds for the brain. So without this white matter being able to connect the different parts of the brain together, we're not able to function as proper, or as what we would normally be able to do. So if there, for instance, in multiple sclerosis, where this white matter is affected, you see a lot of different motor or behavioral issues or problems with such a pathology. And so we're really wanting to know this wiring in the brain is influenced in autism spectrum disorders. And we know for some previous research conducted here by the center, by some collaborators and colleagues, that white matter does matter in ASD. So being spearheaded by this longitudinal, 15-year longitudinal study that really started by Dr. Andy Alexander and Janet Lanehart, following individuals across the lifespan with autism spectrum disorder, as well as those who are typically developing controls. And what we find is that across that lifespan, we do see these developmental differences across with some of these different imaging measures that we see. So for instance, on the x-axis I have plotted here is age, and then on the y-axis is this fractional anisotropy from one of the more important white matter regions, the corpus callosum. And what we see is that early on in life, there might be individuals here in blue are those with autism spectrum disorder, and in black are those who are the typically developing controls. We see this kind of interesting pattern that, there's some different path or crosses here indicating that FA is increasing in the typically developing controls, but more or less staying maybe kind of plateauing or staying relatively flat across the lifespan, which again kind of is an interesting trajectory that gives us information about how the white matter is changing throughout the lifespan. More recently, in another cohort of individuals that we've looked at here at the Waisman Center, we've seen very similar trends. So again, we see early on in life that individuals with autism have a higher fractional anisotropy early on, but then over time that pattern changes, and then the typically developing controls eventually overcome or surpass that trajectory of the individual with autism. And then if we look at different other areas across the brain, like I said, with MRI, we can really look at how things are changing across the brain. What we see is similar patterns, not just in the corpus callosum, but in other brain structures as well. So in kind of the thalamic regions and the internal capsules as well, in parts of the brainstem. So again, this gives us nice insight into what areas of the brain might be influenced or affected when in individuals with autism. But when I show some of these things of these group differences, it's really important to realize that not every individual might be affected in the same way. There's a very clear and widespread heterogeneity across different individuals and across different white matter regions. For example, more recently we've been trying to identify ways to capture this individual heterogeneity, and we've come up with some cutting edge measures to do so. So here on the x-axis, we're plotting a measure that relates to how far away an individual is from the normative growth curve. So you kind of think of it as when you go to the pediatrician, they give you for your child, they'll give you like a percentile of how far away they are along that curve. You can kind of think of this the same way for the brain. So we see in blue here the typically developing controls, and there you see this nice blue distribution that's really close to zero, indicating that they're closer to that normal control pattern. But then in red, you see all the individuals with autism, and you see some individuals here for this specific brain region do indeed look fairly normal or typically developing. But then there are other individuals who are a bit further away from that typically developing control growth curve. And the one thing to really note with the individuals with autism is in that we see this distribution have a lot more variation. So there's this heterogeneity across different white matter regions, and those individual differences really depend on different brain regions. So for instance, this particular brain region here that we're looking at, for the most part, our individuals with autism look very much like those who are typically developing, suggesting that not every brain region is affected in the same way. When we start to tally up different white matter measures across different brain structures, we then begin to be able to separate out those who are typically developing from those who have autism spectrum disorder. So by combining different brain regions across the brain, we're able to separate out and really show that it's not just a single brain region or structure that is influenced in autism, but it's a combination of different measures. And by doing so, this provides greater sensitivity for identifying those individuals with autism rather than just looking at a single brain region. And one thing why this is really exciting is that this now allows us to construct, using this type of measure, a phenotype based on brain measures. And by doing so, we can then take those brain phenotypes and go back and work with psychologists or geneticists to look at underlying behaviors that might be associated with this phenotype, but also begin to probe and look at different genetic causes or environmental differences that also might relate to these differences. And so while I've described diffusion tensor imaging and being this really nice imaging technique that provides detailed information, the one problem with it, one limitation of this technique, is that although it's really sensitive to that microstructure, it's very non-specific, meaning that there are different processes in the brain that could cause similar changes in these measures. For instance, changes in the way that the white matter fibers, those wires, are organized might lead to these increasing FA, but also other changes in the white matter can lead to similar changes. So we don't really, using DTI, we can't understand what processes are actually happening when we look at these measures. And so just as your phone gets updated every year or your computer gets updated, there's been an explosion of these advanced microstructural imaging techniques in our field where we try to improve our measurements and characterization of the white matter for understanding processes underlying the changes that specifically we're using and applying those, developing and applying these techniques at the neurodiversity in autism spectrum disorders. And one of these techniques that we're really spearheading and excited about is a technique that's called NAUDI, but it stands for Neurate Orientation Dispersion Density Imaging. And it's a unique imaging technique that provides measures associated with brain neurite microstructure, so kind of the axons and dendrites in the brain. And really, this technique is relatively new, and it has not been extensively examined in individuals with autism spectrum disorder. And so we've been, like I said, we've been spearheading and really excited for this technique, and for the first time, we're looking at some of these measures within our local cohort that we've been collecting for the last few years. And really what we're beginning to see is that in individuals with autism, we see this pattern of lower neurite density within the thalamus, which is a really interesting part of the brain supporting different sensory functions, which is very interesting in a recent result that we've seen. And if we look at that trajectory again across the lifespan, we see that kind of same pattern within this thalamic brain region that we see using some of the other measures that I've previously shown. We see that again early on in life, the individuals with autism seem to be actually a bit higher with this measure, but then they plateau a little faster than that of the typically developing group, where we then see kind of increases. And what we're actually really excited or interested for using these techniques for is that not only do we see these differences between these two groups, but we also see that this measure is highly correlated and associated with autism severity measured by the social responsive score. And this is, again, a really exciting finding that we're preparing to write up as currently. But not only do we see this lower neurite density, but we also see parts of the white matter that actually look more coherent, and there's less kind of dispersion in the brain. So this here in these areas here in blue are showing that. We see that in the internal capsules in the right superior longitudinal fasciculus, there are actually areas of white matter that seem to be even more coherent than that of our typically developing group. So we're trying to explore what some of these processes and measures might mean, and what they might tell us about the symptoms and outcomes in our individuals. Summary. So I've basically shown that white matter microstructure plays a very important role in the neurobiology of ASD. And despite the group level differences between ASD individuals and typically developing controls, there's wide variation within the brain that we can really use to probe different aspects of the disorder and try to look at how we might be able to tailor different interventions to treat some of these specific brain regions. And then also emerging techniques like NAUTI and others that are more recent provide new aspects for studying white matter, and they may inform on some of the underlying neural processes and the neurodiversity that we see in ASD. And really that's the key part for using brain imaging, is that we need to be able to understand what is that underlying microstructural process in order to be able to help develop new techniques and possible treatments in intervention. And so looking forward, interests are really looking at early brain development. So we know that the brain develops very rapidly, or child develops very rapidly across the first 2 years of life, for instance. But we also know from imaging kids very young in life that there's tremendous brain development during this time. So it's one of the fastest growing periods of development is the first 0 to 2 years of life. We see an explosion of white matter development in the brain. So early on in life, there's very little myelinated white matter, and over time, that process is very rapid. And by about 2 years of age, the brain is already looking adult-like. And so by understanding some of these processes early in life, that might be very helpful for looking at how a child who goes on to develop autism has developed prenatally. And also, based on early brain development, we know that this process of early brain development overlaps tremendously with different stages of behavior. Different brain networks are developing as these different behavioral processes are coming online. And so there's, we know that brain development plays this critical role in behavior, in the development of behavior and cognition. And so we want to understand how these processes are linked. And really, there's very little previous research looking at this critical time period in individuals with autism, more or less because it's difficult to diagnose individuals at an early age, but by following children and watching how they grow, we can maybe be able to begin to understand the neurodevelopmental trajectory of ASD early in life. And then can we use some of these new and emerging techniques for microstructural imaging to provide that kind of new information that we would really like to know. So with that, I will again acknowledge the wonderful team that I get every day, and really the sincerest gratitude to all the participants and families that participate and make our research possible, and also all the different funding resources that we have been so fortunate to have. Thank you. Yeah.
Can you say something about your sample and the issue of consent?
Sure. So our sample that we've collected here is a pretty widespread. So we have kids or individuals between 10 and 40 years of age. And usually the consent process is done in conjunction with family members. So we would have parents help with the process.
Here, I've got the microphone.
Is there some concern about subpopulation selection based on ability to tolerate the MRI?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. So that is one of the big limitations that we have when studying ASD, is that a lot of kids who have very severe forms of autism and may not be able to tolerate the scan, or if they are able to tolerate, they tend to move a lot in the scanner and kind of distort the images that we collect. So here at the Weisman Center, we're trying to overcome that by developing some new strategies for correcting for some of that motion. So if individuals are able to make their way into the scanner, we can hopefully correct for some of the motion artifacts that we might see. We also try to make the scanner environment a lot more friendly of a place for them. Sometimes we can dress up the scanner as like a rocket ship or something exciting that makes it a little less clinical for individuals, and that sometimes helps as well. But yeah, that is definitely a limitation of the research that we do. And generally, we don't use any types of sedation or anything like that for scanning, at least for research.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit. So I'm Lynn Bishop Fitzpatrick. I'm an assistant professor in social work at UW-Madison, and I'm an affiliate in the Division of Geriatrics and Gerontology over at the Med School, and an investigator here at the Weisman Center. Something that I think is really interesting about the Weisman Center is the degree to which we get to know people from very different disciplinary backgrounds. So Doug and I shared an office during the Weisman T32 postdoc, and we've been in a writing group together for 3 years. So as a health services researcher, I typically don't learn a lot about brain development and neuroimaging, but because of the opportunities to socialize and collaborate interdisciplinarily here, I know quite a bit about it, and I've seen a lot of Doug's studies develop over time. So I think it's just a neat way to think about what we do at the Weisman Center and how it can improve our research here. So And to talk first, I want to first say I don't have any conflicts of interest, but I have received, and I've also been submitted by the Wasteman Center T32 postdoc program and through the core grant of the Wasteman Center. I also want to say before I get started that I will interchangeably use different terminology to refer to people on the autism spectrum. So I'll say people on the autism spectrum and I'll say autistic adults. There have been studies recently that have found that people on the autism spectrum or autistic adults prefer one of those terminologies. I know that people have different opinions about preferred terminology for autism. These are what I'm choosing to use. But when I answer questions at the end, I'll be sure to use the terminology that you all use in your questions when responding. So we're going to talk about aging in autism and developmental disabilities. So how did I get interested in this? So I've been working with people on the autism spectrum for 20 years. I started volunteering as a high school student. And I worked as a clinical social worker and as a health services researcher, and I've done agency-based research at nonprofits. When we think about aging with developmental disabilities, we have to think about the historical context. So in the past 30 years to 40 years, we've seen really widespread deinstitutionalization. So instead of people living away from their families in institutions, people are now living in the community with their families throughout their lives. We've seen that, I would like to think that we've seen really increased awareness and acceptance, and that we're doing a much better job than we were 20 to 30 years ago at integrating people with developmental education settings into communities, into jobs, into our churches and social groups. And because of that, we also have seen increased access to care through federal programs like Medicaid and Medicare. I use data from both of these programs in my research, so it's important from a care and also research perspective. And then one really great thing is that we've seen drastically increased life expectancy. However, what that means is that we now have to figure out what happens to people with autism and other developmental disabilities when they hit midlife and old age, so that we can do a better job of supporting them throughout their lives. In the research that I'm presenting today, I'm going to be using a population approach. So what we're doing with this approach is that we're studying people on the autism spectrum, or autistic people, as a group. So we're looking at these big data sets where we're looking at groups of people who are de-identified, who I don't know anything about their identifying information, and we're comparing groups. And what this means is that these findings may not be true for everybody. Like Doug Dean presented in his slides, we see that some people on the autism spectrum are very similar to some people who are not on the autism spectrum. But as a group, we may see differences. So the means might be different, but individuals may not be affected. And what we're looking at is higher probability or greater likelihood of a risk based on being in one group compared to another group. In this presentation, I'll be talking about two comparisons, one in autistic people compared to people from the general population, and the other in autistic people with an intellectual disability compared to autistic people without an intellectual disability, which we typically define as an IQ below 70. And it's also defined by some functional qualifications. So let's think now about old age and autism, midlife and old age. So I don't know who here in the room knows this, but I think something that's really interesting when we think about this is that the first person ever diagnosed with autism, Donald Triplett, who's in this picture right here, is 85 years old, and he lives independently currently in Mississippi, which is in the town that he grew up in his community, and he worked for many years at a bank. Because the first person ever diagnosed with autism is only now in old age, this means that we're really now just beginning to be able to learn about what happens to autistic people as they get older. We've heard for many years from families, and we have studied to some degree that people on the autism spectrum may have greater morbidity or more health problems throughout their lives and may die earlier. And that's specific to the current generation of middle-aged and older adults, not necessarily the current generation where diagnostic services and treatments have increased over the lifespan, and they may have a different experience with supports throughout life. However, we have really limited information and research on why and how health conditions develop, and that limits our ability to prevent health conditions from developing. And for me, what's important is that we're treating health problems that make life harder for autistic people. We're not treating autism. So we're not trying to change autism, we're trying to change the things that make life harder for autistic people and for all of us in the general population. So we view this to a degree from a health disparities lens. So health disparities are inequalities in health that can be that are unjust and should be preventable. So we see in autism that we have more health problems in autistic people at all ages, from early childhood through old age. And then I'll talk about some of our new research on aging and autism. We also know that autistic people have sensory and communicative differences. So they experience the world differently and they communicate with others in the world differently. Lead to challenges access to healthcare, both because of limited physicians who will see pediatricians who have training in developmental behavior pediatrics who are trained to work with people with developmental disabilities. Providers aren't trained in the same way to work with adults, and especially older adults. We also may be seeing that healthcare providers discriminate against people with developmental disabilities and autism, and that in the same way, there is an overshadowing of actual health problems by physicians assuming that they should be treating autism symptoms and behaviors, not health. So right now, we know a couple of things. So we know that there are more adults with an autism diagnosis than ever before. Each year, about 50,000 people with autism reach the age of 18 and become adults. We know that autistic people have health problems throughout their lives. And that, I think, specific to the research I'm presenting today, people with intellectual disabilities who don't have autism also have more health problems throughout their lives than people who don't have intellectual disabilities. We don't know a couple of things. So we don't know what are the common health problems in midlife and beyond in autism. We don't know whether intellectual disability is driving health problems in autism or whether this is something that's inherent to autism. And then we also don't know how we should help and what we can do to help people on the autism spectrum live long, healthy, and self-reliant. Today I'll be talking about these two factors. So I'll be talking specifically, let me see if I can get this to work, about common health problems in midlife and beyond, and then the impact of intellectual disability. And I'll give a couple of tips at the end for things that may be helpful when you're interfacing with providers. So the first study I'm going to talk about I completed while I was in the Waisman postdoc with colleagues from the Waisman Center. So the big picture of this study is that our goals were to identify health problems that would distinguish people who have died. So this was a study of people who had died at the Marshfield Clinic compared to a group of community members who had also died. And we wanted to use a data-driven approach to help figure out differences based on their electronic health records. The major finding of this study is that we were able to find that autistic people do have very, very different patterns of health problems. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. So we had a very unique data set that allowed us to delve into whether we can find patterns of diagnoses that distinguish people with autism from community controls before their deaths. So the Marshfield Clinic is a large practice in northern, central, and western Wisconsin that serves about 97% of the population area. People don't move from this area either. So we also find that we can look at a really large portion of people's lives since 1979 in many cases. We had data on 91 people with autism who had died, and then we matched them to a bit over 6,000 community members who had also died. And we wanted to see what patterns might distinguish people with autism from community members in their electronic health records. So the key to interpreting this is that these are not the most common things. These are the things that distinguish people the most, that differentiated autistic people from community members the most. So I think, as we would expect, we saw things like that people on the autism spectrum used medications in the long term. They had epilepsy, they had developmental problems. I think, interestingly, something that we found is that we saw really high prevalence and a very distinguishing pattern of problems with cardiovascular disease and motor function. We also saw lots of codes in their electronic health records that might indicate that they were going to the doctor was just running some tests without a real reason for them. So they were non-specific, which might indicate an underlying health disparity because people were not being tested for specific things. They were just being given a test because that's what the doctor felt that they had to do. We also found lower prevalence of cancer, and I think that this is important to think about in terms of, we found that they were diagnosed less with cancer, not that they had cancer less. So it could be that autistic people have cancer at higher rates, but it's just not being diagnosed. So these are just what was in their electronic health record. So, and able to use very high quality data. We had on average about 17 years worth of health record data for each of our participants. And it's the largest sample of autistic people before their deaths ever studied, and the first study to look at lifetime patterns of health problems. This tells us that autistic adults may either be diagnosed differently by providers, or that they may have truly different patterns of health problems. So it might be a difference in diagnosis, and providers that might be a difference in underlying health problems in autistic people. The limitations of this study are that this sample of people, so they died between 1979 and 2016. So it could be that this group of people is really different from the current generation of middle-aged and older adults. We also didn't have great and reliable data on their intellectual disability because their psychiatric records were kept separately from their medical records, so we couldn't look at psychiatric records for intellectual disability. So to truly test whether this is something that is related to autism or something that's truly just driven by intellectual disability, we needed to use a different technique in a different study. Which gets me to the second study that I'll talk about. So we looked at, this study was accepted recently and should come out within the next month or so, looking at the health of specifically middle-aged and older adults on the autism spectrum who were Medicaid beneficiaries in Wisconsin. And I did this in collaboration with my colleague, Eric Rubenstein. So why might intellectual disability be important in autism research? So, we do know that people with intellectual disability are in many cases systematically excluded from autism research. We've done a really bad job as a field at including people who have an autism diagnosis and an intellectual disability. We know in intellectual disability, as I mentioned earlier, that there's a really well-established high prevalence of more health problems in intellectual disability. And something that I think is interesting as we're trying to parse health problems and how they emerge at the end of life is whether what we're looking at in autism is really genetic subgroups that are driving these increased health problems later in life that are, at this point, yet unknown. So, and it could be that intellectual disability might be a marker of a genetic subtype that could be associated with more health problems in mid to late life. And then we also know that historically and currently, people with intellectual disability and people without intellectual disability receive different levels of support from our public social service system, but also from their families and communities. So there could be some real social differences that could be underlying differences in health problems. So Medicaid. So Medicaid is most of you probably know what Medicaid is, but I'll do a bit of an intro for people who might not know about it. So it's a state-administered anti-poverty program. So states get money from the federal government and then use some of their money to fund the programs. And it provides free or low-cost health insurance to people who are low-income or who have disabilities. So if you have an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis in adulthood, it's different, qualifications different in childhood, but in adulthood you have to both diagnostic, functioning, and income requirements. So this group of people would have to have assets below a certain level. So they would be what we would typically think of in the research world as lower income. And this provider of healthcare is really, really important for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And when we think about policy right now, we should also be thinking about the impact of cuts to Medicaid on people with disabilities. So I think that that's important as an advocacy topic. So the big picture of this study was that we were trying to describe the physical and mental health of middle-aged and older Wisconsin Medicaid beneficiaries who had a diagnostic code for autism spectrum disorder during our study period. And using these data, our goal was to test differences in the physical and mental health of autistic people with and without intellectual disability. For us, this is the first step in describing the physical and mental health problems that adults with autism have in their Medicaid claims during the study period. This builds upon the previous study by dealing with some of the limitations of our sample, being a primarily geographically located sample, and it also allows us to really specifically test the impact of intellectual disability in autistic people. So this study, which has 143 autistic people in it, is the largest study of middle-aged and older adults with autism published to date. So it'll be the first study of health problems, the largest study of middle-aged and older adults with autism. As we would expect, the sample was mostly male. I think something I want to really highlight here is that although our sample was mostly white, we did have a bit over 80% of people in our sample who were non-white, which tells us that we are actually getting at a group of people that has been systematically excluded from developmental disabilities. And importantly, less than half had an intellectual disability. So we had a really good group in which mental health problems. So a different slide set loaded, but so the bottom bar here is, so the bottom bar is people with intellectual disability, and the top bar is people, let me see if I can get this to work. So, okay, so in the top bar is people who don't have an intellectual disability. So intellectual disability, no intellectual disability. So the key to our study is that we didn't find any group differences between autistic people with and without intellectual disability in any of our larger groups of physical and mental health problems. When we think about actual prevalence of these health problems in autism compared to the general population, even though we didn't include people in the general population in this study, we do see that prevalence of health problems is higher in some cases. So as an example, cardiovascular disease, which is abbreviated as CVD, about 49% of our sample of autistic adults had cardiovascular disease in their mid-50s. In the general population, we would expect that number to be about 37%. So we are seeing that prevalence of health problems is higher, but that we aren't seeing any differences that are being driven by intellectual disability. And this study does, in some ways, replicate the previous study. So we found very similar prevalence of many of these health conditions in this second sample in midlife and old age in autism. And the key is that it suggests that there may be something about the lived experience of being autistic or a yet-to-be-determined genetic factor that may be driving high prevalence of health problems in autism, regardless of whether people have an intellectual disability. The way that we have been thinking about this in my research, more health problems in autistic, so they may be as much as in my lab we're working on some studies to try to understand why this is happening so that we can develop ways to prevent it from happening. So I have some preliminary implications that are based on the good information that we have in the general clinical work with autistic people and some feedback that we've gotten from autistic self-advocates about things when they're interfacing with the healthcare system. So we know that services and supports throughout life are really necessary. So all of us need some support to do well in our daily lives. It may be that some people on the autism spectrum need more or less supports to thrive in their daily lives, but we need to do a better job of including people and supporting them throughout their lives. So we need to be working on social inclusion, we need to support families, we need to help people transition from different independent living environments, so the transition from living with families to independent living when parents get older, and then potentially to moving to a nursing home near the end of life when somebody may require more complex care. So we need to work on supporting people in those transitions throughout life. We need to be making sure that we're doing things to improve health throughout life. So we're doing preventive and routine care for autistic people, just like we would be for all. We need to support people being active and making healthy choices, both in their communities and then for people who live in group home settings or institutional settings. And then it's also possible, and what I'm beginning to think we might be finding is that we may need to be doing some disability-specific specialty care. So that may be related to aging earlier, developing health problems earlier, such as doing earlier screenings for health problems with physicians, maybe 10 to 20 years earlier, like we would for some other people with developmental disabilities like Down syndrome, who we would screen for dementia earlier than we would people in the general population. What you can do as individuals and family members and clinicians who care deeply about somebody with autism is that you can make sure that you have correct permissions on file, so a medical power of attorney to help to make some decisions about what will happen if you can no longer make decisions for yourself, and who will be the person who will be able to make those decisions. If you or the person who you care about has mental health problems, it may be necessary to also have a mental health power of attorney to make decisions when you're unable to because of mental health problems. And then, like all of us, we should have an advance directive or a living will. So making decisions early and collaboratively about what we want to happen to us at the end of our lives. And then, in addition, it's important to have permissions on file with physicians to be able to access medical records. This may be something that'll need to be renewed every year, but it's something that you want to make sure that you're collaboratively talking with physicians about as the person who you care about needs more complex and greater intensity of healthcare as they age. So I did a quick and dirty survey on Twitter of some #ActuallyAutistic advocates who gave me some really good information about what they wish people would know and what they wish physicians would know about preventive care. So we got to know what preventive care we need at all ages and make sure that we're advocating for it. Physicians may not be giving people the preventive care they need, so it's important to make sure that you're being a good advocate for yourself or the person you love or the people you work with in your clinical work. It's important to also request accommodations to help you succeed from a communicative standpoint, and also to deal with any sensory challenges or differences that you may experience. So asking for things like going to a room earlier would be helpful, asking for the lights to be turned down, asking for noises to be turned off on machines. These are all things that providers should accommodate, but they don't know to accommodate unless it's specifically asked for. And then in the same vein as the sensory challenges, it may be that autistic people experience pain differently, so they may experience more or less pain sensitivity. Know that that just may be different, and it may be something that you need to educate people about. And then I think one of the keys is that we don't want providers to inappropriately place emphasis on behavior and autism symptoms when they should be placing emphasis on health and well-being. And it may be the case that changes in behavior or mood in an autistic person may be indicative of a medical problem and not of autism. The key is to know yourself and to be your best advocate and surround yourself with people who can help you advocate for yourself. So, and what are we doing in my group to try to move this forward? So we're expanding our research using larger data sets, very big data sets of tens of thousands of people using both Wisconsin Medicaid and a national 100% Medicare data set, which it provides health insurance to older adults and people with disabilities. We're also beginning a new study this spring where we're going to be talking to people on the autism spectrum and their family members or the people who help them with their health care about health and health service utilization in middle-aged and older adults with autism. The goal of this is to eventually develop a patient navigation intervention and to then be able to train healthcare providers to work with older adults with autism, perhaps even geriatricians who get a little bit more training than standard physicians. So, and I also want to acknowledge my mentors and peer collaborators, and then my team, the Aging and Health Equity and Developmental Disabilities team here at the Center, as well as the funding we've received. For this study, it's really important to emphasize that we also use data from the Marshfield Clinic, which has a really helpful partnership with the Center that we want to be able to acknowledge and thank. So, and I'm happy to take, and thanks so much for coming.
Hi, I was wondering, research has done anything in way of investigating the factor of like stress on these individuals and how that might be increased prevalence of health conditions?
Yeah, so I have a body of research that has actually looked at stress, and I became interested in health through my research on stress. So we that so in my research we found that autistic people report stress don't necessarily in adulthood, especially as they get to middle age, experience stress differently at a biological level. And also found that stress is related with quality of life and health. So some of the interventions that we're working on developing are stress reduction interventions that would also help people navigate healthcare systems. So I think stress is really key, and it might be one of the factors underlying the really high prevalence of cardiovascular disease that we're seeing.
I wondered if there's any kind of legal form that's newly available because of the HIPAA. What we find is we can't make appointments for our sons. We can't really get any information in the same room and him saying, yes, you can talk to my mom. So I don't know if that's available, you know, to put into a medical folder, or if you have any information about that.
Yeah, so based on my best knowledge, which isn't totally complete on this, I don't believe that there is a single form that can make it so that you have access indefinitely, unless you're a guardian, right? Which, you know, and I think there are mixed feelings about guardian. People have different lived experiences of guardianship. So I do know that with the electronic health record, you can request access as a, so if you have Epic which is Epic's electronic health record system, at the physician's office where you see a physician, or at the hospital system you typically use, there is a way that you can request proxy access through the electronic health record, and that way you can actually see the doctor's notes and you can schedule appointments through their electronic health record. So there may be, even though there isn't a really great legal way to do it, a way to sort of circumvent it through new technology with the electronic health record system. So, and I know that at Epic they're actually working on improving that specifically for families of people with developmental disabilities or who have other special health care needs. My husband works at Epic, so and he's on the team who's kind of working on improving the accessibility of Epic for people with developmental disabilities. So I think it's coming, and I think that the way through it is maybe through the EHR until we change legal models.
So you made mention earlier that we need to learn to get doctors to stop focusing on the actual autism and the behaviors and more focus on the health conditions. How do you recommend doing that? Especially since they can't communicate for themselves.
Yeah, so that's really, it's really hard, right? So So the long answer, it'll take longer, is that we need to change physician training so that physicians are trained to better accommodate autistic people and people with other developmental disabilities. They have the right supports in place. They know that people aren't just their behaviors. Pediatricians get that training. Family medicine doctors, internal medicine doctors, geriatricians don't get any training on developmental disabilities, with the exception of maybe like one class in medical school. From a practical perspective, for somebody who's in a physician's office trying to help, I think that the key at this point is advocacy. So advocacy on the part of the emergency contact or loved one or helper who's in the room with the person, or advocacy from the autistic adult. I also, if your physician's office has a social worker on staff, at least in Madison, we train in our MSW program about half of our students specifically on developmental disabilities. I teach a course on developmental disabilities. And one of the things we work on is advocacy in healthcare settings. So I think that's another way to do it. So it's really just good advocacy skills. I wish we had a better answer from a societal perspective, and that society was doing a better job of making this easier for people. But I think right now, advocacy is really key.
Any other questions? Lauren, before responding, can you just reframe the question for our online viewers?
Yeah, so so the question was about the woman who asked the question's granddaughter, who is in an employment setting that's really great and supportive, but where there are issues with high levels of stress even in a supportive work environment, and given our push as a society for people to work, right? So so I think it's a hard question, and I think that when you think about healthcare in our society, it's really a catch-22, because you either need to be able to qualify for healthcare through Medicaid and Medicare, or you need to have a job that pays well enough and that has good enough benefits that covers healthcare well. So private insurance varies in how good it is. Purchasing insurance can be really costly. So working, I think, is this really difficult thing where you want to make sure that you can work, because work gives us meaning in a lot of cases, and it's expected by society, and it's something that we value as a society, but it can be very stressful and difficult. And I think it's a really hard question, because the way that society expects us to be isn't always aligned with what we should be doing or what would be best for us, right? And society doesn't always support people to work in ways that reduce their stress. So it's something we have to work on. I don't have a fix right now, but it's something that I'd like to see change over time.
Just so we can keep on time, I think we'll end questions for Lauren. Thank you so much. Again, just to be mindful of our schedule, we're going to take a brief break at this moment, and we'll reconvene shortly after 10:30. If you have a question for either our clinician or community panel, there were little cards that you could pick up at the front desk. If you have a question, if you could bring those down to the front during this break, that'd be greatly appreciated. There are restrooms directly outside of the auditorium to the back, and some in our main lobby.
where I would be in life.
I think that we will resume our Day with the Experts schedule. So I invite everyone to take a seat. Several of our presenters, if you still have additional questions for them, they may be around after our community panel or in the next break to be able to field some of those questions. All of the talks from today's presentation will be included on the Wasteman Center YouTube channel and will also be archived on our Day with the Experts webpage along with PDFs of each of the presentations. So you'll be able to access some of the resources that were mentioned as well as the slides that were presented. I would like to invite our next speaker, Madeline Barger, come up, and her talk today is Sex on a Spectrum.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? No. How about now? Better? How about now? Okay. I'll stay right here. All right, so hi everybody, I'm Madeline Barger. I work here at the Weissman Center in the Autism Treatment Programs with Dr. Murphy, who you saw on some of the introductory slides. And so I am a family therapist, a behavior analyst, and a sex therapist. And I have really been blessed over the last 10 years to work with people with autism across the lifespan from ages 2 to mid-60s. So I have a passion for this work in treatment and in the clinical realm. So a big focus of my work is actually transition. So throughout the teen years and throughout adulthood, and it's a huge part of that topic is daily living and quality of life. It's really impossible to have that conversation without intimacy, connection, relationships, and sex coming up at some point. So even if somebody comes in with a completely unrelated treatment question, we end up somehow getting to that topic in my work. So I found it really important to use evidence-based approaches with that. So what I want to say right off the bat here, PowerPoint is not switching, but we'll make it work here. Okay. Well, we'll keep going. So let's see. Okay, so I think you can't see what I can see, but it's okay. So whenever we talk about sex, we're managing new information, okay? We all bring sex learning histories and behavior histories to the table when we have this conversation, whether we're being professional in our role in the conversation or personal. So it's a unique experience for everybody, and it's certainly a unique experience for me every time I have this conversation. So 2 really important techniques for managing new information. So first, if you hear something new or uncomfortable, take a deep breath. And second, write down your questions for the end so that you can remember them. And if you do have a question that you think is maybe more of a personal question, you can contact me here at the Weissman Center and we can kind of try to get that question answered. So Teresa, the slides aren't switching with my PowerPoint. There's Clark. Maybe, let's see. Oh, sorry. Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you. Back on the track here. Okay, so the content is personal, even when it's professional, because we all have histories with this topic, and traditionally the topic of sex can feel a little taboo. So why are we doing this? Why are we having this very public conversation about something so personal and so private? The reason we're doing this, the reason this presentation contains sexual content, is for the single purpose of uncovering sex education gaps and discoveries in clinical work. There are a lot of conversations that we're not having that I want to start here today. So use parental discretion. I don't actually see little children running around today, but use discretion about what's appropriate for younger people. And note, this is really important with sex therapy work. All individuals from case studies across the country represented here are completely de-identified to protect privacy and confidentiality. In fact, we're going to use George. So George is a made-up person who's going to follow us through our talk today, in the various case studies and represent hundreds and hundreds of people. So that's George. So today's agenda, I'm going to start with first a 3-part mission that we all share in terms of sex education and behavior. Second, I'm going to talk about research from over the last 9 years from other people. I'm a clinician, not a researcher. I'm going to talk about how that research influences my clinical practice and share some clinical experience. And really, most importantly, I'm going to talk about what to do with this information as parents and clinicians and people who support individuals with neurological differences. So our 3 objectives. So first is I want us to have an increased awareness of the diversity of sexual practices that are out there. Okay, so that's a huge topic that comes up in treatment. People feel sort of pathologized and shamed for their diverse sexual practices. We want to make no assumptions about somebody's sex education needs or behaviors. Second, I want us to have an understanding of sexual behavior as human behavior. So in applied behavior analysis, all behaviors are subject to the science of behavior. They all function under the science of behavior. So even sexual behaviors, they have an antecedent or a trigger, an observable, definable behavior, and then a consequence that follows the behavior that over time will determine whether the behavior continues or stops, right? So all behavior falls under this umbrella, whether it's sexual or not. I do understand a lot of people will tell me it's much easier to talk about potty training with a 3-year-old than self-pleasure with a 25-year-old, but those are both behaviors. And being able to do those behaviors safely is really important for someone's quality of life, whether it be self-pleasure or potty training, okay? So let's sort of think of those things as similar. And then also our last objective is going to be we need to understand that there are learning differences in sex education for individuals with neurological differences like autism, just like there are for any topic and just like there are for any of us. And the answer that I've really found that has the best outcomes anecdotally with the clients I work with is to individualize sex education plans. Okay, so that's really where we're going with this. Okay, so let's talk about our 3-part mission. So as parents, teachers, clinicians, we are all potential sex educators and behavior models every day, all day long, whether we like it or not, want to be or not, whether we've signed up to do this or not. So we're always modeling behavior. We're always modeling what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong, all the time, okay? And even if we think we're not modeling this, children are reporting to me in the treatment setting that they're learning about sex in all sorts of crazy places. So even if we think that they're not learning about it from us, they're learning it from the bus stop to the classroom. And the accuracy and usefulness of the information they're receiving varies greatly depending on the source. So let's go to George, okay? So George is, in this example, George is in middle school, and he stays up late one night before getting on the bus the next morning without his parents' permission, and he watches a really graphic HBO movie with a really hellacious sex scene, okay? So he goes to the bus stop the next day with this new education he's received, and he shares the details of this information with friends. We'll call them friends 1, 2, and 3, okay? So friend number 1 hears this and thinks, this doesn't sound at all like what my mom said sex was going to be like, and not at all what I'm learning in the sex education classroom. So I'm going to check with those 2 sources about whether this is accurate. Great, good for friend number 1, right? Friend number 2 thinks something that's a lot more common. This is amazing. George, you have told me what my sex life is going to look like in the future, and I am forever grateful to you. So that's exactly what I'm going to expect. And then friend number 3 hears this, and this is also really common, and I can remember feeling this way. Friend number 3 feels horrified that sex has come up at all, and is like, can't process any of the information, is staring at the sidewalk, and wondering how they're going to get through their first class that day, okay? So all 3 of these people received sex education that day from George, and based on their learning histories, their behavior models in their life, they all have different lenses through which they will manage and filter this behavior. And I'm actually not going to tell you out of these 4 people in the example who has autism, because it doesn't matter, okay? Because we all are filtering this information through our own lenses, all right? Now, even if we think, thank goodness, the person who's uncomfortable and the person who has mom to talk to are going to get the same sex education in the classroom, that's not really true. So what we need to remember is we're still filtering our lens in the classroom. In fact, a lot of people are horribly uncomfortable in the classroom setting learning about sex, even though it's important that that's available. So this mission 2 of 3 really represents that. So what we need to sort of understand is that research is showing us sex education curriculums are not really completely addressing the behavioral learning needs of individuals with autism, and individuals with autism are telling me this. So instead, we need to look at some modifications. So where do we get these modifications? Because there's not a ton of research out there about what to do. That's mission 3. Adults with autism, this is where I get my information. They are the experts on how to modify sex education curriculums in a lot of ways. So what we're going to do is we're going to lift the treatment curtain today. We're going to go behind the scenes in sex therapy with individuals with neurological differences. And I want you to note, every time I talk to somebody, I learn something new. And this presentation in particular was actually inspired by Nancy Alar, who's moderating here today. And she sort of gave me the courage to have these conversations more openly, because there are some really great learning differences out there and behavior differences out there that we need to be talking about. So first, let's talk about what sort of research and studies we do have. So this first one here, this is just a very brief overview I'll give you, is this one's pretty obvious. Parents and kids with autism are saying it's difficult to talk about sex. Lots of parents with all their kids are saying it's difficult to talk about sex. One key difference with our population that we need to look at that's coming up is that what parents report in these studies they're most comfortable talking about don't actually maybe match what the future sexual practice of the individual is going to be. Okay, so we'll go back to George. So George's mom has had 3 children, so she's really comfortable when it's time to talk to George about pregnancy, conception, contraception, and sexually transmitted infections. Those are the ones that parents say, not just parents of kids with autism, but lots of parents say they're really comfortable covering. George, fast forward 15 years, and this is really common, George has been in trouble for some public masturbation. So he's in my office talking about how he got 3 hours about pregnancy, he's glad he knows about babies, but about 2 minutes about masturbation in his sex education in his life, okay? So what we may be comfortable talking about may not be actually the most useful information, okay? So that's a huge reason. Also note that people with autism report learning about sex from fewer sources than their peers, because they may not be getting that same experience at the bus stop that the person standing next to them is when people are talking about sex, okay? So again, I look to sexual practices of adults with ASD and just diverse sexual practices that everybody reports to look at what we need to be teaching, what we need to be aware of. In doing this, I'm hoping we can clear up some misunderstandings and close a knowledge gap that exists between autism and their same age peers per research in terms of sex education. So we'll have to do some modifying. So behind the curtain we go. People think there's a scary monster behind the sex therapy treatment curtain. There is not, okay? The reason there's nothing scary is that we all bring to the table diverse sexual experiences, desires, thoughts, and ideas, regardless of what our actual behaviors or practices are, okay? And sexual, when I'm talking about these things, note sexual doesn't have to be erotic, it could be intimate. I've worked with, hand-holding is an incredible example. I've worked with people where hand-holding is a deeply erotic activity, and with people where hand-holding is an intimate activity. It's not erotic at all. Everybody gets a hand-holding, okay? So we need to note that there's a difference between what might be erotic and what might be intimate. We all have some level of a need for connection. Sex, as a huge umbrella term, meets our needs for connection, intimacy, relationships. We don't all have the same level of need, but we have some level of need, okay? So we are about to go behind the treatment curtain. There's a table behind the curtain. What I want to share with you is that these are just behaviors that come up a lot anecdotally in treatment. So I'm not saying that everybody with autism is interested in these topics or engages in these behaviors. In fact, lots of people in the general population are interested in these topics and engage in these behaviors. But what I will say anecdotally is that with a large cohort of my colleagues in sex therapy, when we talk about the different presenting concerns that we're working with, I'm almost always the only one who works exclusively with autism, and I see a lot of these things a lot more often anecdotally than other people, okay? At least that they're areas of concern in sex therapy, all right? So here we go. So this is the table behind the curtain. So on one side, it's a sex intimacy topic or practice, and on the other side, it's behind the curtain. When I say sex or intimacy topic or practice, this is something that comes up a lot in sex therapy. Okay, it's as simple as that. Or it's an area of sexual behavior in which someone engages or has high interest. All right, so the very first one I call social constructions of sex. So this is a really important topic. When you're working with somebody who may have communication or social differences, we need to make no assumptions about the words I have sex or I'm having sex. Okay, so that's the first one. So what I mean by that is, I'll go to George again. So George cannot legally consent for various reasons to sexual intercourse, okay? And so they come into treatment because George is at home and he's been telling his parents, I'm having sex. They're really worried that George can't consent to this, that he's somehow being hurt by this experience, or that his partner maybe can't consent to it. Okay? And what we find out is that George is saying, I'm having sex, and he's actually talking about hand-holding, consensual hand-holding with his partner. Okay? So a lot of times when we hear I'm having sex, we think about heterosexual sexual intercourse with a penis and a vagina. And I'm having sex could mean infinite different things than that. Okay? So that's the first thing to think about with communication differences. The next piece is touch and sensory experiences. So a lot of people will talk about how individuals with autism have unique touch and sensory experiences, and then we kind of stop there in sex education. We actually need to go a lot further. When we individualize a sex education plan for somebody, we need to be able to help them, if this is what they want, to advocate for the right kind of touch. And I've worked with individuals all the way from people who do not want to be touched at all but still want to have a sexual experience, which is completely possible, to people who need extremely intense touch, intense and pretty different touch than someone who doesn't want to be touched. So there's a continuum of needs there, and in order for someone to be physically safe, either if they're doing this on their own or with a partner, we need to be talking about advocacy in that area. The next one, now I call this objects of affection because other names of this are highly stigmatized, and I'm not going to go into it greatly because this could be 8 hours in itself, just that topic. But if you have run into this at home, you know what it is, or if you do this, you know what it is. So basically, this is more common than one might think. It's often subject to misunderstanding, but people with autism will report unique, profound relationships with objects that are really cool, and it's not uncommon over time for some of those relationships to maybe become sexualized, okay? So it's definitely a topic that comes up, and the reason I'm sharing this is because I've had a lot of sessions with people where they're crying and screaming about something that's really not an issue that they've discovered at home with the person they're supporting. It's really not actually a dangerous thing. So that's why we're talking about it. The next piece is role play. So a lot of adults are telling me that role play in sexual experiences is really appealing because consent is clear, scripts are available, scenes are structured and practiced, and it can become a really predictable social experience, okay? I'm sharing this again because if mom discovers that George is meeting people online to engage in a very safe role play activity, mom gets really upset about this. We really don't need George to change his behavior in this case if we've assessed that he's being safe. We need to educate each other about how this is just one of a huge diverse array of sexual practices. The last one is the biggest one there, self-pleasure and mission. So this may comprise a person's partnered sexual course or partnered sex, and self-pleasure is a perfectly appropriate and fulfilling way for them to meet their sexual needs. Okay? That's really important. And then finally, we need to take really special consideration for these last bullet points. So studies are showing people with autism and their parents report great diversity in sexual orientation and gender identity, and they're not the same thing. So the way somebody identifies in their gender might be very different from who they're attracted to, who they actually have sex with, and who they partner with. So those are two huge things we need to be aware of and need to be updating in our individual sex ed and in our curriculums. And the final one is really important, the online world. I have a curriculum specifically for online dating with individuals with autism because there are social rules online and offline. I also think it's really important that we be talking about pornography because that's a huge topic online that comes up in treatment. Okay, so it's great if George and his family come in, they work on understanding each other in these areas, and everybody's fine and happy, right? But people that come to sex therapy, that's not usually how it goes, right? Usually they're there because they've suffered in the world with some things. Sex therapy is actually a lot about grief, and that's something a lot of people don't realize. So that's our but. What about when a behavior does become unsafe and needs to change for some reason? What do we do? Is all hope lost? No. So we look behind the curtain. The sky's the limit. There's no monster, even when we have to change a behavior. The reason there's no monster is because as long as we're using evidence-based approaches, the sky's the limit. We can teach almost anything. We can support safe practices while still meeting a person's individual needs. So for behavior analysts, they think about assessing a behavior. In social validity is hugely important, though, when it's a sexual behavior. So this is what I mean by that. Adults with ASD are telling me they've been on a long journey before they see me. So if somebody wasn't aware of their autism diagnosis, or they didn't even have the autism diagnosis, they may have experienced a lot of stigma, a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of mislabeling, okay? And sometimes therapists aren't trained to work with autism, and so may have even a diagnostic and statistical manual diagnosis that doesn't tell the story of the whole picture. So I'll give you another example of George. So George is pacing outside of his neighbor's house at night a lot. And he's wanting to work up the courage to ask his neighbor on a date, okay? He happens to get off work at 8 o'clock at night, so he's doing this in the dark. So eventually he gets arrested and he gets into mandated treatment, and he works with somebody who labels him with the label from the paraphilic section of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So by the time I see him, he's been labeled and treated for voyeuristic disorder, which is spying for sexual gratification. And what we determine is he was not spying for sexual gratification. He was not stalking this person. He wasn't doing any of those things. He was not sure how to start a conversation with this person, okay? So that's why it's really important when we enter sex therapy or sex ed with somebody with a neurological difference that we understand their journey there. Otherwise, we won't even be able to begin the conversation. If we have a mislabel, why do we care about labels? Because they lead to ineffective treatment. So if somebody's been mislabeled and shamed, they're going to communicate a lot less with us about what they need, okay? If the communication is a lot less about a behavior, the secrecy about a behavior increases, the unsafe behaviors actually increase, and most unfortunate is that punitive interventions in response to these behaviors from parents increase because people are kind of scared or weirded out, okay? And punitive interventions are not evidence-based as our first line of defense when trying to change a behavior, okay? They're not the first line of defense. So instead of doing that, we need to make no assumptions about somebody's sexual needs, practices, definitions, or desires, and we need to pack some big bags for this sex therapy journey. So you need to be looking for somebody, if you're looking for someone to work with a specific sexual behavior for someone with neurological difference, there are certifying boards that vet somebody, that say that somebody is able to do this safely. So look for family therapy, behavior analysis, and sex therapy, okay? Because it's important that you have the appropriate clinician so we're not going to get further misdiagnosis. What's way more important, and sometimes people are surprised by this, what's way more important is what the parents pack for this journey, if the parents are part of this journey. So it's more important than the clinician, that if someone's supporting an individual, they know how to do it appropriately. So parents have to be able to listen, to reflect, and to practice the evidence-based strategies, and to call for a network of help as needed if they're managing a long-term sexual behavior that's been unsafe. Why does this work? Because sexual behavior is still behavior. Behavior analysis and family treatment is a model for sex education and behavior assessment and change. What's different is that we really have to do a lot of work to depathologize the behavior. So we have to use what I call your soul. So stop judging, observe, and listen. All right? This is about what the person wants that we're working with. We need to determine, is this behavior causing the person distress, or is it just a misunderstanding? Distress would be the person reports they're upset by it, their parents, it's hurting their relationship with their parents, with their partners, or in the realm of safety at home, work, and the community. So if we determine that's the case, then we move forward with analyzing the function of the behavior so we can support this person in finding something more safe to replace that behavior, okay? I've listed the 4 functions of behavior. These exist with sexual behavior too. So somebody may engage in a sexual behavior to get attention, to avoid an aversive stimuli. They may do it to gain something. They may do it automatically because it's pleasurable. That's a really big one, right? So when we understand why somebody does something, if that thing is unsafe or dangerous for them or another person, we can replace it with a more appropriate behavior. And George is with us again, and we're going to talk quickly through an example of this with George and the dreaded dates, okay? So this is a list of strategies that I use a lot and that I used with George. It's consistent with applied behavior analysis. It's in Wolf 2009. And George came in really upset about dating, and it was causing him a lot of distress. He'd gone on hundreds of online dates with people who never contacted him again, okay? And this is a pretty common story. His parents were really stressed about it too. He was working and living at home. They were upset because George was upset, okay? So everybody's upset about this. We determine it's not really shocking, right, that the function of the continuous dating behavior is to get positive attention from would-be romance. We all deserve this, right? We all deserve the ability to get that. So in order to allow George to do this in a way that met his needs, we kind of looked at what wasn't working. So George was able to say, well, my dates are telling me I'm rude. Well, what does rude mean? Well, rude actually meant interrupting and asking what dates found to be inappropriate questions. Okay, so those are two examples. So we found replacement behaviors for those. So ways that George could get the information he needed in a more appropriate way, and he was able to get second and third dates. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through some of the steps. So first, we needed to talk to George about exactly what a date was to him. What's a conversation to him? What information is he looking for? I don't hand him a task analysis or a list to the steps of a date because I'm not going to make any assumptions, remember, about what a date is to George. So together we come up with a list of what these behaviors are from beginning to end and what George desires them to look like. That's our first step. We use visuals. This one's really dark, of what to do and not to do. I'm not sure if you can see it, but so we use visuals of what to do and not to do on a date, so that if George learns better visually, if George learns not in just the written format. We also use videos of people that look like George if we can get them. If we can't, we try to look for people who are in similar age range as George, people going on successful dates. This one's really important. We do modeling with myself and a clinician, or myself and the parent, about what the date looks like. And George gets to operate this like a television. He gets to tell us when to stop, ask questions, tell us what wasn't realistic, what didn't work for him, etc. And then we role play with George. And if we can go into the target environment or the place the date is going to take place and practice it there, that's really useful, but we can't always do that. So we do our best with that. Really important for teachers and clinicians. It would be really awkward for me to go watch George on a date in real life, right? I don't get to do that. I'd love to do that. It's not appropriate. So we have to debrief really well. We can't debrief well if we don't have an agreed upon task analysis about what was supposed to happen, okay? So George and I sit down and we talk through all of these steps. What actually happened, what didn't, what worked, what didn't work, and how do we need to update our approach here? And really this works if we are ready to have the energy to do it over and over again, right? Because none of us would be able to do this in one shot. We have to do this a lot. That's why I want parents to have a network of support if they're part of this treatment journey. Why, when George's parents said he has to just stop dating, help him stop dating, did I say? Absolutely not. We're going to help him date better. Why? Because when we talk about sex, this includes all of our life systems in our humanity. It affects us in ways we don't even imagine until we have a sexual issue, right? Then we notice it. When we talk about sex, it involves our knowing, feeling, doing, and living. So talking about sex increases one another's knowledge. That's the knowing piece. The feeling piece is that anytime we do this, we may be shining light in the darkness. That includes somebody's shame and fear. We have to be really careful with this topic. The doing piece is that we really do improve behavioral outcomes when we're brave enough to have this conversation. And the living piece is literally we save people's lives, okay? So people avoid going to jail, they avoid feeling lonely forever. If we can have this conversation, we can save lives. I've included a paragraph here. It's really the bottom line. I put it on here because you can access this later, and I want you to have the summary, and I'm just going to read it to you. So we, as a society, we need to consider alternative sexual lifestyles, behaviors, and case conceptualizations that are non-pathologizing, non-judgmental, person-first, and behavior-focused with emphasis on consent, social validity, and safety and intervention, rather than recommending abstaining or removing a behavior that we don't understand, right? We have to understand it before we can make any adjustments to it. There's a visual here of the process that I go through to do that in the treatment context. My references are available for you. I have a list of great books for you to look at. And what I want to do is really thank you for letting me start this conversation. It's a much longer conversation that I want to continue in the community. And remember that we are all sex educators, whether we want to be or not. So the people we support deserve that we are accurate and useful in the information we provide. So thank you.
I imagine that there'll be some questions from Madeline. With that being the case, and we're going to set up for our transition to our clinician panel, but we'll take some questions while we prepare for the clinician panel.
Thank you.
I did have one question. We recently got a person in our care that's on the autism spectrum. And their view of sex is not matching up to what we are modeling in our home. And there is now some strain on our relationships and stuff with this person. So how do we go about possibly re-educating what sex is?
So the first sort of step would be to determine, is the difference in understanding causing that person's strife in their life? Did they have a desire to learn a different understanding of it? Because if they don't, that might be the first step, is to figure out, is it possible to coexist with two different understandings? Is it a behavior that's difficult, or that's challenging or causing them harm? Because if it's not, we have to meet in the middle. If it is a behavior that is causing a problem for the person and for their surroundings, or an understanding of sex that's causing an issue with that, you may have to sit down and decide what's appropriate and what not together. But if this person is an adult, it's not appropriate to say this is what's right and this is what's wrong. They have to be part of that conversation. And it may be a matter of, how does their definition of sex influence their interaction with you? Because sometimes it could be as simple as, you think of sex as this, so you engage in that activity in the bedroom. It's something like that. Does that make sense? So it's a big question, because you could go down a lot of roads to either change or not change an approach. Does that kind of make sense?
Well, a little different direction. How and when would you discuss menstruation with a 7-year-old autistic girl?
So that would depend on if menstruation is started or not. Because if someone's menstruating, they had a conversation about it, you do it right away, you talk about it right away. If somebody's not menstruating yet, but you're thinking that's going to be a topic of concern, you want to start with examples of like positive people in the person's life. Could be anybody, could be a person that they look that is in their walking, talking world. It could be a person from the internet or a cartoon. So it's really useful with younger children to talk about how a certain thing like menstruation is really common. Everybody may experience it in one form or fashion, directly or indirectly. And there are people out there that are models of how to experience it in a positive way. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Can you go back one slide, please, to the resources?
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, the books?
Yeah.
Yes, and there's a lot more. So I'm making a sheet.
Would you mind staying on the commission? Sure. So we will post all of the PowerPoint presentations as PDFs on the Waisman Center webpage for Day with the Experts, and then all of these talks will also be available immediately on the Waisman Center YouTube channel, but it'll be one continuous, and then we are going to parcel them out, and those will also be available on the Waisman Center Day with the Experts webpage. I think I am going to go because we have our clinician panel, and also then one of the most meaningful of our Day with the Experts, I think, is when we bring community members up and they can share their firsthand lived experiences, and so they're prepping for that right now. But let's thank Madeline for a great presentation. I'm going to invite our clinicians to come forward, and Lindsay Meharry, who is the director of the Autism and Developmental Disability Clinic here at the Waisman Center, is going to moderate the panel, and she'll have each of the clinicians introduce themselves. All right, I'll let them get settled. And Madeline, are you joining us? Okay, Madeline will join us as well in case there are some additional questions for her. So thank you for joining us. Like Teresa mentioned, my name is Lindsay Meharry, and I'm a psychologist and the director of the Autism and Developmental Disabilities Clinic. I'm going to have each of our panelists briefly introduce themselves with their name and their discipline, and then we'll get to your questions. So Madeline, if you want to reintroduce yourself.
Hello? No? I'm having trouble with microphones. So I'm Madeline. I work with teens and young adults in the autism treatment program. I'm a family therapist, behavior analyst, and sex therapist.
Hi, I'm Haley Crane. I'm a psychologist. I work in the clinics here, and I also work as a part of the research teams.
Hi, I'm Megan Dubin. I am an Early Start Denver Model Certified Therapist and also a treatment supervisor in our Starting Together program here at the Weisman Center.
And I'm Kelly Haugen. I'm a speech language pathologist here in the Autism and Developmental Disabilities Clinic.
And I'm Megan Sheely, and I'm an occupational therapist in the clinics here as well.
Thank you. So our first question has to deal with medical visits or healthcare visits. And if you have any suggestions for individuals who may experience some anxiety around those visits, of how themselves or the family can advocate for resources or things to help those visits go better.
So I can start. As an occupational therapist, I think the sensory component is a huge piece, and it really helps us if we have any heads up. So if you know that certain things might affect your child, to let us know. So we have dimmer lights in our clinic. That can be really helpful. Another thing can be rooming a child in your family early so that you have the environment in the room, providing toys that might help your child feel comfortable, or you can always bring toys or snacks with you. So starting to think of some of those environmental factors we're happy to provide, and I'm sure other clinics would be too, as long as they know.
So I think there's a variety of answers depending on what the person's needs or reasons for feeling stressed are about. From a communication standpoint, I think there's a lot you can do to like foreshadow or prepare someone ahead of time by pre-teaching. At any age, you could maybe take a look at the building that you're going to go see online. Some places have a virtual walkthrough that you can do and see, just help kind of ease some of that stress of where are we even going, can be helpful, or seeing the pictures of the people that you might be seeing. I think it's also really helpful not to share your stress about the situation with the person you're bringing to the doctor. Sometimes we have families who come and they are telling their child, you're not getting a shot today, you're not getting a shot, and that really wasn't even on their mind. But it is now. And so, making it very fun, I think, and preparing your provider to know what they can do, like you said, is helpful.
We try to do pre-visit phone calls with a lot of our families that are coming to the clinic, and I think that's a really nice time for you guys to share what works best for your kids and who's coming, because we want to be able to tailor it to the individual that we're seeing. So I think that's really helpful.
And I will add, some healthcare providers will do that, where they will have a nurse or a nurse navigator reach out to a family ahead of time. So that would be a good opportunity, like Haley mentioned, to share any concerns that you have or needs for the visit. Okay. So our next question is about transition. So are there resources or recommendations that you all have for somebody transitioning from high school to college?
That's a really big question. So there's a lot of resources. So where to start with that question? So I think if someone's transitioning to college, it would be really important to start with what the school has available, supports during the school day. What do they have available to start preparing somebody for that transition? There's also, and was it college specifically that they're transitioning to? People do campus visits, but it's also really important to meet with who will be available to the person individually. So it could be that there's a case manager at college, someone who supports the program they're in. If they aren't in a program where there's a support system, it'll be really important to line up peers, social attachments ahead of time. So where are they living? Who's going to be living with them and near them? Is there an RA? So you really have to look, it's really contextual. So you have to look at who's available in the immediate environment for the person. General resources, there's a transition toolkit that's available through the Autism Society online. If you just Google that, you'll find that. Do people have other thoughts about really specific documents to look at?
Yep. The only thing I would add to that is that you shouldn't hesitate to start too early. Transition doesn't have to be something you think about at grade 11 or grade 12. You should be thinking about it all the time and each transition, and so hopefully it's not a very sharp transition at certain places, and certainly it does feel that way, but hopefully the transition pattern has been something that you've been working on and having support in with school, because the IEP process should be very helpful. So I don't know if it's thinking of specific tools, the IEP should be something you've had discussions about transition on.
And there is, we do work in the autism treatment programs on specific questions around transition in like our program model. So in Growing Together, somebody could come for a minimum of 12 weeks to look at a really specific sort of behavior or a few behaviors to manage around transition, or sort of questions they have around transition. So that is something we can focus on. We do have multifamily sessions here where at this time we do have insurance restrictions, so we are able to meet with 2 to 3 families at a time and to go through the Transitioning Together program material, but really individualize it to the person, what they're looking at in transition, and provide resources there. There are a lot of them. I would actually welcome emails about the questions, and I could send you a big list of what we give out in that program, but it's a really big question.
And I think that ties in, or did you want to add something? That ties into the next question, was about resources that are available for parents in terms of supporting an adult on the spectrum. So I think maybe that would be another thing that's better via email. If you want some specific resources, we could provide that list. So we have about 10 more minutes. Those are all our written questions, so we can open it up to questions from the audience for our panelists. No questions?
There's some back there.
Okay. Does somebody have the microphone?
One back here.
If you just speak loudly, I can repeat the question back. Okay. And that is a very good question. So the question is about access, which we know is a huge issue both for those diagnostic evaluations and for treatment across the state and across the nation. So as a center, I think that's something that we're very passionate about in terms of changing that, but that takes time. In the meantime, in terms of resources, I don't know if you want to speak specifically to your structure, and then we can also talk about the regional centers.
So in terms of treatment, the first step is to call really our main line, and we do a screening. And really what happens is, because we're pretty restricted in terms of schedules, a lot of times there's not a great answer about the wait list, right? It's not first come, first serve. It is based on your schedule and the clinician's schedule and the openings that they have. So in treatment, the first step is to call. And when you call, if you do ask for resources or other referrals, our clinicians get those questions and get that information, so we make sure we get back to you to answer those questions. And we have that in place this year and last year. So if you had called sooner, you maybe didn't get all of those answers because we didn't have that in our workflow, but now we do. So
I think as providers, we definitely feel that too, and are trying to actively figure out ways to support families better and quicker. I think there's no magic wand, unfortunately, right now, but I think we are all trying to put our heads together to figure out how we can get resources out to families, how we can try to help figure out ways for access to care in other places, not just Madison, but within the state of Wisconsin. And so I think the regional centers here right now are something that's really great to be able to voice your concern, and also try to figure out if there's resource that maybe you don't know about that you guys could get access to that isn't at the Wasteland Center, but maybe somewhere closer to home, that we've been trying to help find more resources.
Just another plug for the Resource Center. Tim Markle is standing in the back there, and he and I think I saw Lisa was here today too, is that right? They're hanging out in the atrium next door, so if you want to check in with them before you leave today, you may be able to talk about some more specific tailored resources that you have for questions for your family too. Does that sound right? Do you have anything to add?
Thank you for that 5-minute commercial.
Yeah.
That's all done. Money checks.
Yeah. That's my TED Talk. Okay.
Other questions for our clinician panel? Yes.
So in the school system, I have a high-functioning autistic girl who is in 4th grade. So she'll be transitioning because she goes to Sunset Ridge. But she's been tested several times for speech. She has pragmatic language issues, which get her into socially awkward situations, and now entering puberty will be its own issues as well. But the school system really does not provide any help with that. They've already said she doesn't meet the requirements. So I guess where are we supposed to go now in terms of getting her assistance with pragmatic language? I mean, she does go to IDS, but really working with her with that pragmatic language piece. Where do you recommend?
So the question was about a 4th grade girl with autism and having delays in pragmatic language or social language, but that not being something that falls under the purview of her IEP. So what are some other resources or recommendations that our panelists have to provide some intervention around that?
I can start, but I know there'll be other folks who have ideas too. But you mentioned being assessed for speech, and I guess I just want to kind of make sure that we think of that in a broader way. So perhaps you started, and maybe I don't know your story, but maybe you've had connections with a speech language pathologist and they weren't seeing the challenges there. Social language is more than just under the speech language pathology umbrella. So I think they can be helpful, and many times they are very helpful in some situations, but sometimes it takes more of a broader look for that. And so thinking about what goals do you have for your daughter? Can they be met by other people on the IEP team at school? So maybe a social skills group led by a social worker or led by a guidance counselor can be just as effective. It doesn't have to be a speech language pathologist who says, I'm not going to see your child. I think community-wise, there might be other things that folks might add, but I think looking at your school team maybe more broadly, if you can convince or get some support in that way of who else on the team is supporting these goals for our child, and how do we do that? Maybe there's a peer advocacy or peer connections that they're making in other ways that doesn't look like pull out time from classrooms that we can consider as part of their programming. I hope that's helpful. I don't know if anybody has any other community. I know you said community resources outside of school too. So
I think Megan.
I was just going to add on to what Kelly was saying. Sometimes it's asking your school too, who has social skills training at this school or who runs those groups. So like Kelly was saying, some other specialists sometimes at the school, and it depends per school and per where training is, but can also be social workers running those social skills groups, psychologists, occupational therapists sometimes run social skills groups. Sometimes it can be not trained specialist per se, but it could be a peer partner social skills group. Or so maybe there's some other options, and sometimes it takes kind of thinking outside of the box to try to find those options as a team together at school.
I would even talk to your community-based provider. You had mentioned that you guys are seeing seeking services outside of school. And the same thing, talking to them about, are there social skills groups? Are there other things that they can do at IDS that would support your family and your needs?
I just want to validate, it's so hard, I think, for families to figure out how much can go into school versus how much can go outside of school, and who can be our advocate in school, and does that mean that the assessment needs to happen in school versus outside of school? And I don't have a perfect answer for that, but I know that it's confusing to kind of navigate sometimes, and I think parents, supporting parents sometimes is almost some of the best resources I've heard when we've been doing feedback for families, that they're sometimes the ones that find the best support for each other, but I do understand that that's a definite struggle.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes? That's great. Yep. So we had an example shared of a group that was formed at a specific high school to accommodate a social skills group, and that group was formed by an occupational therapist, and there are options to be able to write that into the IEP, and it's been really helpful. Mm-hmm. Right, so thinking about how the school day is structured and what are some alternative ways of structuring so that there's less academic time loss for other appointments or services outside of school. So are there any other questions for our clinician panelists? Yes?
Yeah, when I was in first grade, I was in the Circle of Friends event. Yeah, I remember I used to live in Lodi, and but when I was in first grade, I remember that in my Circle of Friends video, one of the people in the video has said something about me that I couldn't communicate until I was in my early childhood years. And, I remember, have you ever heard of self-esteem?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I've done that in my elementary days, and I remember that because since I'm an autistic guy, I usually get backs rubbed from my teachers in the classes, and I also push down my shoulders,
Yeah, it sounds like you've had some really good social supports.
Yeah, and then I also I remember when I was in elementary, I remember that in class that reading was so very easy for me.
That's good.
And,
well, I want to talk with you afterward, but I want to transition to let our other panel come up here so we can kind of move the day along, and then we can talk a little bit more afterward. So thank you for sharing, and thank you to our clinicians for being up here.
As our community panel takes the stage, I just want to say, as Chung mentioned in his overview, we do 4 of these Day with the Experts each year. These days would not be possible without the support and partnership of community partners like the Autism Society of South Central Wisconsin. They really are a driving force in helping us promote the event. And Nancy Alar, who is going to be moderating the community panel, she's the president of the Autism Society and has really been an advocate for individuals with autism for many years. So I'm delighted to introduce Nancy, and I'll invite our other panelists then to come and have a seat. 15 years.
15 years.
Yes.
Is that how long we've been doing it?
Yeah, it's the 15th annual.
Wow.
Well, I thank Teresa for reminding us it's been 15 years since we've had this panel of experts and since we've had the day with the experts. And I didn't remember it was 15 years, but I was actually the first moderator of this panel 15 years ago. I'm actually the president of the Autism Society of Wisconsin for less than a year. They managed to hornswoggle me into this position a year ago. But I'm very happy to be here. And I wanted to also mention that we also have a new executive director with the Autism Society who was here this morning but had to leave early. Her name is Kristen Engel, and we hired her back in November, so she's new also. Oh, she's right here in the back, waving her arms as she's heading out the door. Kristen, want to just kind of walk down the aisle just a little bit so we can see her face? She's our new executive director, but she's going to have to leave here in just a minute. And we have some exciting things going on, and we have a table in the back with some materials if you want to stop by and pick them up after the presentation's over. And we do have a great panel of people talking to us today, and I'm just going to let them introduce themselves after I say their name. So we have Allison Vogel. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself, Allison?
So I'm Allison. My older brother Adam was diagnosed with autism at 3 years old.
And next to Allison is Lindsay Bessie.
My name is Lindsay, and my son Parker was diagnosed at roughly age 3, and he is now 9.5 years old.
And next to her is David Scott from Janesville.
Hello, I'm David, and I was diagnosed with Asperger's when I was 21, and I'm 30.
And then there's Tricia Bartley.
Hi, my name is Tricia, and I have a 6-year-old with autism. He was diagnosed when he was 3 years old as well.
And then Scott Scholler, who is also from Janesville.
Hi, my name is Scott. I was diagnosed in 3rd grade as PDD-NOS, and I was later labeled as Asperger's.
Thanks, panelists. The way this is going to work today is our panel is supposed to last until 12:15, and we have some prepared questions that we are going to be asking the panel members to react to. And then about 10 minutes before, about 5 after 12, we're going to open the questions to the audience to see if you have any questions you would like to ask of our panel members. So we're going to start with our first question here, and we're just going to go down the line from Allison to Scott to have them react to them, and they of course can pass if they don't want to answer or don't have anything to add. So, how did you find out that you or your child or your sibling is on the autism spectrum? So Allison, do you have any comments for that?
So Adam was my older brother, and so I can't really remember a time when I didn't know that he was autistic. It was just something that I grew up knowing, and it was just part of our family to accommodate that and to accept that.
So with Parker was my first child, and we had a daughter about 1.5 years later. And what was eye-opening for me was when my daughter started surpassing the milestones that he should have been achieving. And I brought it up to our pediatrician, and the pediatrician at the time just said, well, you know, boys can develop a little bit slower than girls. And so, of course, you trust the experts, right? And so I didn't think much of it. But eventually, I went back and I was persistent about it because I thought there was a pretty significant speech delay at the time. And eventually I was referred to our early childhood program in our school district at the time, and he was getting speech services. However, they identified and were very proactive with us as parents. We wanted, my husband and I were very vocal about, we wanted their opinions. We wanted to hear what they had to say, because we knew that Parker had some challenges and we wanted whatever resources available that we could get. And so they were actually the ones who encouraged us to get Parker in a early childhood program and eventually got us in touch to get him fully diagnosed. It was more of a gut level feeling that I had as a mom, knowing that something was off, just when I would compare his milestones and the way he reacted in certain situations that really were eye-opening for me. And so I'm very grateful that we were persistent, and then also we had some really good experts in the educational field, and then ultimately in the medical field as well, to really guide us along the journey.
I have some mental illnesses as well, and I was in the hospital at the psychiatric unit to restructure my medicines, get me off my old ones, put me on new ones, and they.
Can you hear Scott?
And and my nurse there, or doctor, I'm not sure what she was, diagnosed me with Asperger's when I was 21. So yeah, so it was my most recent diagnosis, but yes.
My son began showing symptoms around 2.5. He was always really focused on his gross motor development and was really doing well with that, but his speech was just not developing as it should have been. So with the help of our pediatrician, we got into the Birth to 3 program at the later half of that, and they were the ones that recommended that we get the diagnosis. So one thing led to another, and then we did receive that diagnosis when he was about 3.5. So it took about a year.
I was diagnosed as PDNOS in 3rd grade. That is according to my parents. It was a long time ago. One of the defining features that I had is that I stuttered a lot, not so much anymore.
Thank you. Our next question is, what has been your experience with education and the school system?
So I'm a teacher, and my mother is a teacher. She has her degree in elementary education and her master's degree actually in early childhood special education, and one of the reasons she pursued that was because of my older brother. Adam was diagnosed in 1987, and we were from a small town. There were not a lot of students at the time who were autistic, and so she very much pursued her own education as a parent, and not just her own education, but then pulling resources into the school system to make sure that his teachers were educated about what autism was, what milestones to look for, what his behaviors were going to be like, what kind of resources he would need, what strategies to use with him. She was very persistent in that education, pulling in experts to our small town, having them come and give talks and Q&A sessions so that they could learn about what autism was to help Adam. She was very involved in his IEPs, having a background herself. So she made herself very knowledgeable about the school system in order to support him.
Overall, up to this point, I feel very blessed with our school experience. We actually used to live south side of Milwaukee in Franklin, and their school system was fantastic. We recently moved to Middleton, and so far have been very thrilled. And the one thing I do have to say is that Parker is mainstream, but he does get special ed services, whether it be OT, speech, PT, but then he also has an aide within the classroom, and usually it's a shared aide. And I would say it's probably the aide that has been just been such a blessing in both situations, because really they're the strongest advocate for Parker when we as parents cannot be there, and really helps get everybody on the same page. You know, we've had throughout the years, there's been some regular teachers who wanted to be more involved or didn't want to be more involved, and that's fine, but it was because of that special ed teacher we were able to really bring it all together.
I've lived in 3 different school districts, and it was very good living in Michigan. It was very difficult living in Indiana, and I really did a lot better in high school once my guidance counselor kind of came on board, and she knew who would work with me both willingly and just kind of who would kind of drive my personality and who wouldn't teacher-wise, and would put me in the right classrooms and really made me thrive with the right placement. And it's very good to go to a larger high school, so if I didn't work with one teacher for that grade, it wasn't like that I was the only teacher for that that subject. It was very helpful. So yeah. You have your mic. Keep forgetting.
So my son is in the Madison School District, and he's currently in kindergarten, so we just have 2 years of experience in the schools, and overall they have been great. But I would say my biggest challenge was that transition between doing ABA, 35 hours a week, into transitioning into the school system and now being sort of without ABA for that amount of time. I wish there was some sort of bridge for that service. We just got off the wait list after 13 months for another ABA service, but I just wish they were a little bit more meshed together in terms of building the early childhood education into the school age kids, because I just feel like there's kind of a missing link there. But overall, school has been a good experience for him.
Could you define that? Did you say AVA?
ABA, which is the Applied Behavioral Analysis, that's what most very young children get in terms of autism services before they reach school age.
My experience with formal education has been mixed. When I attended public schools through 10th grade, I had an IEP most of the time. Sometimes I was treated more like a special education student, other times more like a gifted student. My experience at the university had been much more consistent overall. I would like to remark that UW Whitewater is known for its exceptional disability services. And also keep in mind that my experience with the K-12 system was in the 1990s, so it's very likely things have changed.
Okay, this next question is kind of related to the last question. What is one thing you would like to tell teachers and schools?
So I'm sort of on both sides of this because I am a teacher, but when thinking about my brother as an elementary age student, I would say that his biggest needs were patience and understanding from his teachers, especially as they learned what autism was, and the consistency of schedule and routine. My brother really thrives on that and needs to know exactly what's going to happen. He needs predictability, and so the more structure you can give those students, the more routine and predictability you give them, the safer that they feel.
One of the things as a parent, I have an issue with the term good enough. And partly because I know that my son is very, very smart. However, he learns differently. And I've had many, many conversations at IEP meetings where the teachers would tell me, well, he's not a hindrance to the classroom, or he's right, maybe he's below average in certain academic subjects, for instance. But my whole thing is that we are trying to really groom these children to be an active part of society as an adult. And so just barely getting by, that's not okay for me. Now I know that the school districts and the school system, they have different rules they have to follow. But I think when us as parents, we want to encourage our children to be as active as possible in everyday life. We have to continue to be an advocate for them and push them, because otherwise they get used to having, I guess putting minimal effort. Because my son, if the subject is not of interest to him, he may know the material, but he's not going to try. And so I'm always saying we need to push him a little bit further. And of course you don't want to push too hard either, but there's that balance that you need to find. And then also really helping the teachers understand if you can gear a particular subject to something he's interested in. We had this one teacher in math, and that is not a strong suit of Parker's, but the teacher knew he loved Minecraft. And so you know what? She went and got some different curriculum, and it was Minecraft worksheets. And you know what? He was one of the best kids in math that year. And so just trying to rethink the way that they're teaching the concepts and really suggesting things as a parent, it's really come a long way for us.
I had some, I was in some special ed classes, and one of them, a special ed class I was in, was a team talk class, and the lady, there were two women, and I had, I can't think of the word, help for adjustments to help with schoolwork and tests and stuff, and one of them was turning in things later than most people because I couldn't get it done in the right amount of time. And you know, the one lady and one teacher said, you know, you're with a bunch of other disabled students, and the least thing you can do is turn your stuff in on time. I said, don't you read my IEP? You know, like why are you not doing your own homework and you know and reading, you know, reading what you are supposed to read? And she was just like, oh. So I was not impressed.
Overall, I would say again, I've had a good experience with my teachers in schools, and I think that the root of that has been the communication. I make sure that I'm emailing with his teachers at least weekly, and I do get to volunteer in the school system, so I get to see what he's doing inside the classroom and see where his peers are, because as a parent of one special needs student, I don't always know where the other kids are, and in terms of where my son is with the classroom too. So just an interesting perspective.
I presume it is quite common to underestimate students with autism, especially those who are less verbal and or have stress issues. As a side note, a teacher in 1895 reportedly told Einstein, who had traits associated with autism, that he never amount to anything.
Okay, our next question is actually kind of in two parts, because we're going to ask Alice and Lindsay and Tricia to address this question. As a parent or family member, what behaviors do you find challenging and how do you address it? While Scott and Dave are going to answer this part of the question, as someone on the spectrum, what behaviors do you find challenging about your family members and yourself and others, and how do you address it?
So I wouldn't say this is challenging for me, but so I have Adam, who's autistic, and then I have a younger brother, Alex, who is neurotypical as I am. And those relationships for me are very different. And so for me, it's often trying to find common ground with Adam and to have that relationship be as close as possible, considering the different communication styles that we have. You know, there are lots of things that we have in common. We both like to read a lot about history. We enjoy music a lot. But that relationship and building it with him, I had to accept that it was going to be different than the relationship that I have with Alex, and nurture it and enjoy it for what it is, and those opportunities that I have to spend with him, spend time with him, enjoy things with him, because of the way that we communicate. I treasure them in a way that maybe I don't with Alex, just because our relationship is easier. So it's something I wouldn't call it a challenge, but I would call it something that I've had to adapt to.
Now that Parker is a little bit older, our challenges have changed. Initially, when he was much younger, the meltdowns were very challenging because we couldn't understand what was going on. You know, he would be crying for milk, we'd give him milk, and it would continue and it would snowball into way worse. And so that was challenging then. But now we've gotten past that, and as he's gotten older, we struggle with seeing the social interactions. You want to help as a parent and help guide those social interactions. And when he was a little bit younger, that's expected as parents. But now he's almost 10 years old. He needs to figure that out on his own, and we have to take a back seat and watch things unfold. And it may be uncomfortable as a neurotypical parent to see, because it's like, Parker, didn't you pick up on that social cue? Or maybe he's just talking about one of his favorite interests that a neurotypical kid is like, I don't really care about that. So, and he'll go on and on and on. So that's been challenging, but you need to help guide, but at the same time, you need to let him figure that out for his own. And the other thing that we struggle with too is some stimming behaviors. Parker likes to run back and forth and kind of do this twirl and make I don't know if it's a car noise or what, and he's done it for years now, but he's a big kid at this point, and so now I'll be downstairs and I'll hear him upstairs going back and forth, and it sounds like the whole house is going to come down. But the thing about it now is he can talk about that behavior, and he says he needs to do that. He needs to run, and that just means he needs to get that sensory input and get back into a healthy regulation zone, and we can have those conversations now. So we're working through that as well.
One thing that is hard for me is if my parents are kind of frustrated with me that they say they're not yelling, but to me it sounds like they're yelling. And I mean, with my disabilities, things affect me about much deeper than most people. Like I love watching America's Funniest Home Videos. My dad says they should just hire me to be in the audience and laugh for them. But yeah, so I mean, that's kind of hard to know when people are upset with me or not, you know. But I'm working on it.
I would say my biggest challenge along this autism journey has been managing my own expectations as a parent. And some things are easier to manage. For example, Christmas this year, he didn't want to open presents, and that was fine. He didn't want to play with toys, and that's fine. But managing the expectations long term, I guess, is what I'm still working on. Like, you know, what is his future going to look like, things like that. So I'm just day by day trying to manage what my expectations look like for my son, rather than, you know, letting him have his own journey.
I tend to be a perfectionist and place a lot of faith in logic. I learned to be more patient with others and know now that not everything is going to make logical sense with regards to human behavior.
Okay, the next question. What are your experiences or concerns about the transitions to adulthood?
I would say that for Adam, it was the development of secondary mental health issues that puberty brought about. That was really challenging for our family in supporting him, getting him the help that he needed, and then for us as a family to support Adam in the way that he needed.
Since Parker is almost 10, I would say the number one is the fear of the unknown. We don't know what the future is going to hold. It's kind of an emotional topic as a parent, to be completely honest. There's some days where I think, my goodness, you know what, if we can get him on the right track, he could maybe go to college and really thrive there. But then there's other days, because there's good and bad days, where it's like, oh my gosh, he is going to still be believing in Santa Claus and sleeping in our bed at age 40. I don't know what to expect, you know. So we have to scenario plan and just take every day as it comes, and we'll just have to figure it out.
I love Christian radio and Christian music, and excuse me, I really wanted to right out of high school work for the summer at a Christian radio station down in Rockford. We live in Janesville, and work with DVR on that, and they were helpful in some places, but other things they're like they just didn't get it. And I told them I want to be on this certain station, and don't want to be on the air, and I don't want to do sports. And they say, well, here, you can work over in Fort Atkinson, you can be on the air and do sports. I'm like, no. I'm like, what part of that don't you understand? I said, well, maybe I like to work with animals. And they said, how about Build-A-Bear? I'm like, that's not an animal. But they finally listened to my dad and me, and it worked out well. So that was fun.
I would say that my experience is exactly the same as Lindsay. She's just a little further ahead than I am. I try not to worry that far ahead because there's not much I can do about it right now, but I am trying to be mindful of teaching him life skills at home so that we can start preparing ourselves if he is able to live independently, and hopefully that's where we're going.
I believe meaningful full-time employment is generally a big concern for those in the autism spectrum. In my case, I've had a number of part-time or intern positions. Another personal concern is finding a long-term romantic partner.
Okay, the next question is, what is one thing you would like to share with parents of people on the spectrum?
I would say, and my mother could probably back me up, that she heard he's not going to be able to do that a lot. She can recall a meeting with his high school guidance counselor telling her he's not going to be able to go to college. He won't succeed. You need to look at a community school for him or a trade school. And my mother point blank looked at him and said, he's too smart for that. My brother has degrees from UW-Whitewater in mathematics and accounting. He is very capable and he's very smart. So you have to be willing to imagine a future for them before they're going to be able to see it. And you have to be willing to fight for it, as my mother did. But he is so much more capable than the adults at the time gave him credit for.
Well, I definitely echo what Allison just said. I would say overall, you have to be an advocate for your family member on the spectrum, because you need to speak up, and if you have to educate yourself too, to know what's out there, what the options are. Early on, I read so many different books, and you know what, I was tired, but I knew that I had to still read just so I could educate myself and know what could we be thinking of doing, what could the future look like, what other services would be available that would benefit Parker, because certain services don't necessarily help every single person on the spectrum. You have to figure out what meets their needs.
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Lindsay was saying about good books. And my dad read a book called Healing ADD, and my dad's like, it sounds like they interviewed David before they wrote the book. And but also that it's really helpful, at least for me, to be told good job and to give hugs and stuff, and that it really helps me a lot. Oh yeah, I keep forgetting.
For other parents, I would say the biggest thing, as Lindsay said, would be self-education, because you do need to be the biggest advocate for your child. Whether it's medication or therapy services, their guess is not as good as your guess is, even though they are professionals. So that would be the biggest thing. And then the other thing is becoming a part of the community so that you know that you're not the only one going through it. And I think that's pretty big. Nancy's been a great advocate for the autism moms and dads out there, so we really appreciate her.
Homeschooling can be a beneficial educational option for those in the spectrum, as it may help the student with autism become more independent.
Thanks, panel member. I can't resist adding here a thank you to the Wiseman Center for all of the stuff they have done for people on the spectrum. My son who's actually in the audience today, Matthew Ward, he's 40 now. He was in the second daycare class for the Wiseman Early Childhood program here, and he became the first person they ever know of who had a full-blown autism diagnosis to graduate from the UW-Madison. And he is still gloriously autistic, and I wouldn't trade him for the world. So, next question. What activities bring you joy and/or satisfaction?
I would say Adam likes to read. It's really a challenge for him to always comprehend what he's reading, but he really enjoys sports books. He loves sports statistics, unsurprisingly. He also really enjoys reading about history, and so he and I have really great conversations about history, and he's got a really great memory for it. He plays trombone in 2 community bands, and for the past 15 years we'll go to the varsity band concert here in Madison, and so that's something I always look forward to sharing with him. He enjoys going to Whitewater and watching his football and basketball and baseball teams and then talking about them. He was really excited when he got to go to Virginia and watch them play in their Stag Bowl, which is their national championship, and win. So those are always, those kind of things really bring him joy, and that like the sports and the things that we can talk about together are really, I cherish those because they're moments when we really get to have conversations and just really enjoy each other's company.
So once my son finds something that he likes, he loves it, and he researches it to no end. And because of that, I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot about the different types of owls and what every hoot of an owl sounds like, depending on the breed of owl. And so we've tried to kind of branch out. And so for Christmas, he wanted this light where we could go and watch for the owls outside. And so that's something at least we can do together. He also has an affinity for different trains, particularly the Big Boy 4017, which is at the Green Bay Train Museum. But he knows where it's a type of steam locomotive, and he could tell you where each one is at what museum across the country. And so we do go to a lot of train museums together. And then the other thing that he absolutely loves, which is a little unusual, that he has a love for pipe organs. And so when we moved here, we had to research churches to find the best pipe organ. So that helps motivate him to go. But he's actually taken lessons now, which is exciting. It took a while, though, for him to understand we couldn't have a pipe organ in our home. So we do now have an electric one, thanks to eBay. We got a good deal on that. But, things that I never thought would be a part of my household or everyday conversation are. And you know what? I think it's a blessing because he's challenging me as a mom and as a person to learn about new things.
Well, with Asperger's and OCD, everything to me is a detail. And I like to draw buildings in perspective. Right now I'm putting on bricks on my latest building. And it's really repetitive and tedious, which I like. And I also a coin guy, and I specialize in error coins, mint mistakes. And so I'm looking at it with a 16-power magnifying glass of these coins, and I'm finding lots of errors for both myself and for my boss, which makes both of us more money. And so having super focused stuff really helps me do my job better, actually. So yeah, it's a lot of fun.
So my son really enjoys going to the zoo, which is challenging this time of year, as you can imagine. He also enjoys the Disney Pixar movies, and he's great at telling you every single line of every single movie. So we've got that. Hopefully we can turn some of these interests into larger things like Lindsay's done. I think that's great.
I try to walk daily. I enjoy learning new coding languages, watching old Enterhumus movies, and also I play impromptu piano songs as I've had lessons for about 11 years.
Well, that is the end of the questions that we pre-selected for us, and it's just about 5 after now. So I'm going to open the questions now to people from the audience who might want to ask questions of our panel members. So do we have someone with a microphone here to, well, you might have to talk loud. Okay, back.
Yeah, I just have, for Tricia, you said that you wish that they had carried over the ABA to as your child got older.
Yeah.
I worked for a early childhood through kindergarten, 12th grade. What would you like that to look like?
I guess I would just wish there was more consistency, because it was like everyone wanted to have 40 hours a week nonstop for, that 0 to 4 or 5 years old. And then all of a sudden it was like, the place we went anyway for ABA was like, we can't do anything else now that you're in the school system. Like, you need to find another way. And there wasn't really a smooth transition for that. So I don't know if there could be ABA services provided within school, or if there maybe due to population, there just aren't enough ABA services available to handle the after school needs, because obviously if you can only do after school from 3 to 6 at night or whatever, that obviously is a timing issue. So maybe there just aren't enough providers out there at the moment. So I don't know what it would necessarily look like, but if there could be a more cohesive transition, I guess that would be great.
I can speak a little bit to that too, because we actually did have a transition program, and at that point is when we switched providers for ABA, because we wanted that as well. The original provider, where we were getting close to 40 hours a week, they wanted to pull Parker out of school, and we were not comfortable with that as parents. We knew he still needed assistance with some of those daily living skills and some of the other things that we were working on. And so we actually switched providers and found someone who was willing to work with us, and it made for very long days. He got off the school bus around 3:30, and then we had someone in our home until 7 o'clock at night. But I'm glad we did it. So I think it depends on the providers and probably the area where you are, if there are those services available. It was until through 2nd grade.
Wow. More questions? Yes.
This question is for David. With you getting such a late diagnosis, what was your biggest struggle with having a diagnosis at 21?
I don't know if it was a struggle really, because I'm still me, you know. I wasn't surprised. It just kind of made sense. Like, oh, that's what that is. You know, and I've been diagnosed with ADD and schizoaffective and OCD and bipolar as well. So I keep Walgreens in business. But it's like, oh, that's what you call it, you know. It wasn't that surprising, I guess. So if that answers your question.
Yeah, question?
My question is for Scott and maybe Allison and Nancy. Family members' experience, but your experience at UW Whitewater, what specific resource do you think was essential that they provided that really helped you, or what was a resource that you wish they may have provided more or at all?
From my experience, they tend to provide very good disability resources in general. They have a kind of person. They generally specialize in particular disabilities, so my kind of person works a lot of people on the autism spectrum.
One thing we used when my son went to college, which turned out to be a really good thing, was we worked through the student job board, and we ended up hiring someone who was another student, who was a student with special ed, and we used that person as a support person for my son. And it was a very win-win situation, because we paid them, you know, basically a little over minimum wage, and their job was to be like his employee, and he was or in this case it was a she, was a support person for him, to go with him to class the first week and make sure he had the syllabus and identify any potential pitfalls in the class. But the main job was to not be mom, because you don't want your mother following you around on campus when you're a college student. But that person became like a part of our team, which was the other part of the college experience, was that we constituted a team that was, of course, my son Matt, myself, his advisor, and his job developer, and anybody else that was, for a while we had an autism consultant, whoever we needed on the team, and we met at least twice a semester to figure out what was going on. And then that person who we had hired to be his support person would report back if there was any potential problems. That turned out to be probably our best decision for the whole thing with the college experience.
So Adam also attended UW Whitewater, and they had a good resource center for him for students with disabilities. I do have memories. The summer before he was set to attend UW Whitewater, they hosted a 6-week on-campus program where he was living in the dorms, taking classes. It was a way to practice and transition. And the first time my mom drove him down to campus, and he drove himself because he had his own car, he came back twice that day to our house and refused to go back. So we kept having to drive him back, and then we kept having to drive back with more people. So eventually the third time, it was my mom, my grandma, myself, and my younger brother to all get him to stay down there. And I remember sitting in his room with my mom and grandma and his roommate, and Alex and Adam went to go play basketball, and he finally was able to stay there for his 6 weeks in the dorm, be with his roommate, take his classes, and that was a really great transition for him before he started at college. He knew the campus already, knew what classes were going to be like. So that transition program was really important for him.
Just one side note, someone asked my son once what was the main difference between high school and college. His answer was more buildings. Any other questions? Yep.
I'm just looking for ideas on transition between college or being done with, post high school and finding a meaningful employment for my family members. So I'm finding like there's kind of an end of this for us, and it's really hard to see where it's going to go. How is going to find a job when you're sort of under the radar, you don't quite qualify for services in this case, that he's not going to be able to be disabled, he's not quite that far. Very difficult, and I'm just looking for ideas from anybody.
My dad was a big help for me, and just kind of went around to various coin shops and things that I'm interested in, and said can David work here? Can David work here? Can David work here? And we just kind of badgered him until he let me work, and it's been a lot of fun. And I work for a coin shop in Janesville now, and I kept going in, and every time I could see it open, nearby, when you're gonna open, when all this, you really want to work for me, don't you? And so, and it works well. So yeah, just be persistent, and pick what your kid likes, and go from there, and just badger them until they, until you find something. That's what we did. So it's a state for badgers anyway.
Catherine, do you have something to add?
That there are a lot of people who don't qualify for other services that do qualify for DVR. There's a much, it's much easier to qualify for DVR.
Could everybody hear that answer? DVR will help a lot of people who don't qualify for other services. DVR is the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation, and they will help you look for employment. But I definitely second what Scott has said, and although I think the person who originally asked the question is now dealing with someone who is already out of high school, but Timbo Grandin definitely emphasizes that you should get, if you have younger kids, they should be on a track to have some kind of employment as absolutely soon as you possibly can do it. Somebody who's 14 can shovel walks, walk dogs, anything. It's really important to get them experience with reporting to someone else, because one of the things that people on the autism spectrum struggle with is the whole idea of when you've got a job, what you are doing is you are working to satisfy someone or solve someone else's problems, because they are paying you to do something you would not normally do for yourself. And that is totally different than going to school. People on the autism spectrum have trouble connecting with that concept, because they often think that the whole business about you go to grade school, you go to middle school, you go to high school, you go to college, you get a job, they think that's some kind of a continuum, and they don't realize what a big change it is from going to college to getting a job, because you're paying someone to teach you in all of those teaching situations, but someone else is paying you to solve their problems when you get to the job part at the end. That's really important and very, very different than paying someone else to teach you things. So, and also jobs are open-ended. People often don't know, it's not highly structured as to what you're doing. often employers expect you to figure out what you're supposed to be doing when they don't know. So it's really important to have employment experience as soon as you possibly can. One of the good things about my son going to college is he had student employment dollars. That's not the correct term, but he had jobs in libraries all the while he was going to school, and now he works in a library. It's probably not the best use of his math skills, but he likes it there, it's quiet, and he does his math on the side. So just from my standpoint, that's just some advice I would give. And Temple Grandin does have a pretty decent book that she wrote about tips about finding jobs for people on the spectrum. That's something you might check out also. More questions? We're getting near the end here. Yeah, you can often, that's a really good point. You can often get in somewhere just by being creative in that way. And it's also helpful to sit down and think about what those issues might be and document them in a professional looking introduction letter. Because the real problem that often gets people fired is if they look pretty normal up front and get hired and everything, then, but they have those issues that may crop up later, and the person's working and one of these issues crops up and it's a surprise. It's the surprise that gets you fired, because people don't know what's going to happen next, and it's scary when people get an unusual surprise, especially when the person doesn't even realize they've surprised their employer. So if it's possible to have something that says, I'm on the autism spectrum in a very matter-of-fact way, this